Royal Guard Edward Bolton's boot connected sharply with the side of the crying girl, her small body crumpling onto the rain-slicked cobblestones. The echo of the impact reverberated through the palace courtyard, silencing the faint murmurs of onlookers. She let out a muffled cry as her frail hands clutched a bundle tightly to her chest, trembling in the cold drizzle. "Move along!" Edward barked, looming over her with the rigid authority of a royal guard. His uniform of crimson and gold glimmered under the gray sky, and his boots, polished to perfection, did not bear even a drop of mud from the girl's fall. He turned away to scan the crowd that was closing in on the edges of the courtyard, their shocked faces feeding his simmering irritation. "This is royal property, not a place for beggars." The girl said nothing. She struggled to sit up, her wet hair plastered to her pale face as she gasped for air. Her bundle had partially come undone in her fall, and Edward's keen eyes caught a glint of something golden within the folds of the dirty cloth. He frowned, stepping closer. "Stand up!" The voice cracked like a whip, but she just huddled in more tightly, clutching the bundle tighter, as if her life depended on it. The only sounds now were the whispered rain and the rustling of the crowd, the air thick with tension. And as Edward stooped to snatch the bundle from her embrace, it fell away sufficiently to disclose its contents. A chain of gold, to which an escutcheon of brilliance still adhered, the bearing of which Edward instantly recognized: his family crest. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The girl's wide, tear-filled eyes darted between Edward and the necklace. The murmurs from the crowd swelled, carrying words Edward didn't want to hear. "Royal crest? What's she doing with that? And could she be—" "Where did you get that?" Edward demanded, in a suddenly lower voice, laced with an unfamiliar unease. He reached for the necklace, but before his fingers could graze the chain, the girl's survival instincts kicked in. In a flash, she scrambled to her feet and darted away, dodging puddles and slipping into the shadows of a nearby alley. Edward only hesitated a split second, until instinct stirred him to motion. Surging forward, the sea of faces turned to shut off his path, but it was too late already, because she was out of sight, small frame whisked into a labyrinth of narrow streets about the palace. The murmurs became hushed accusations, and Edward felt the weight of their blame lean against him. His heart began to pound in his chest as he looked back towards the shining necklace that was engraved in his memory, the royal crest, in the hands of a street child. It just didn't make sense. "What have you done?" a voice cut through the rain, trembling with fury. Edward turned to see an elderly man staring at him, his face pale and stricken. "Do you know who she might be?" Edward's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He turned on his heel, striding back toward the palace steps, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet face. It was then, as Edward reached the gates, that a sudden movement caught his eye. A hooded figure standing under the shadow of the arch. Its face hidden, but its gaze unmistakably fixed on him. Edward froze, instinctive warnings roaring in his head. There was something not just wrong about it, but dangerous. The rain poured harder, heavier, as Sir Edward Bolton paced back and forth in his quarters, the polished marble walls doing little to muffle the turmoil in his mind. The faint outline of the royal crest haunted him, flashing before his eyes every time he closed them. A mere street beggar. How could she have had that? His instincts told him this was no coincidence, yet every reasonable thought screamed otherwise. He slammed a fist onto the oak desk, rattling the delicate trinkets atop it. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered low, but his tone was taut with frustration. His mind went back to the girl's wide, terror-stricken eyes, her desperate clinging to that bundle. A thief? A spy? Or... The thought sent a pang through his chest. Somebody connected to the royal family? A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in!" he barked, masking his unease with the commanding tone of a guard used to unquestioned authority. A young footman entered, his expression pale and uneasy. "Sir Bolton," he began, his voice barely audible over the rain pelting against the windows. "There's been an inquiry from the king's chamber." Edward stiffened, his blood running cold. "What kind of inquiry?" The footman hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "A servant reported seeing a girl near the palace grounds earlier today. They mentioned—" He gulped, visibly ill at ease. "A gold necklace with the royal crest." Edward's stomach churned. He kept his expression neutral, his voice carefully measured. "And what did the chamber request?" "To find out whether anyone among the guard had seen anything peculiar. They're anxious." The footman's voice shook, and Edward heard that he was trying to mute something there. "And?" Edward prompted, his voice low and close. "Speak honestly." The footman flinched. "The steward of the king suggested it might pertain to the disappearance of the daughter of Lady Eleanor." The words hung in the air like an implacable fate. Edward's chest tightened. Lady Eleanor, the king's cousin, had been in mourning for weeks after her daughter Amelia had vanished during a royal procession. The search had been discreet but relentless, and the implications of the girl's presence near the palace, holding that necklace, began to claw at his resolve. "Dismissed," Edward said shortly, waving the footman away. As the door closed, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. If the girl was Amelia, he had just kicked the missing child of the king's own cousin. The thought made him feel as though the air in the room had been sucked away, leaving him gasping for breath. The courtyard was deserted as Edward made his way outside, pulling his cloak tight against the downpour. He went back the way he had come, his eyes scanning the slick cobblestones for any sign of the girl. The necklace, the crest, Amelia. It was too much, yet he could not turn his back on it. His position and possibly his life depended on finding the truth before the royal chamber demanded answers. As he neared the alley where the girl had disappeared, something caught his eye. A small, muddy footprint hardly visible in the dim light. His pulse quickened. He followed the trail deeper into the shadows, the alleys narrowing and twisting like a labyrinth. A muffled cough arrested him. Edward froze, hand going instinctively to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He peered into the darkness. His eyes quickly adapted to the gloom. And then he saw her. She was crouching behind a stack of broken crates, holding tightly onto the bundle against her chest. She was breathing raggedly, and her eyes darted to him as if she felt his presence. Edward moved closer, and the boots crunched in wet gravel. "You!" he called out, keeping his voice low but clear. The girl flinched. Her arms tightened around the bundle. "Come here, now!" She didn't move. Her gaze flicked behind him instead. Edward turned, but there was nothing there. He turned back to find the girl gone, deeper into the alleys. Frustration churned within him. He gave chase, his boots splashing puddles as he rounded one corner after another. The girl was quick, her small frame slipping through cracks and crevices he couldn't. Then he heard it, a harsh, almost indistinguishable sound, a rustling, followed by a low voice. Edward froze, pushing himself against the damp stone wall as his heart raced wildly. Popping his head around the corner, he saw the girl again. This time, however, she was not alone. A figure knelt beside her, dressed in a cloak, its face shrouded in darkness. They were speaking in hushed tones. The girl's hands were gesturing wildly as she clutched the necklace. Edward strained to hear, but the rain swallowed their words. His instincts were screaming at him to interfere, but something was preventing him from doing so. Who was this stranger, and why should he help her? Edward clutched his sword tightly and leaned closer to catch at least a fragment of their conversation. Suddenly, the figure in the cloak turned, its hood falling back enough for Edward to glimpse its face. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a face he knew, but the cold, calculating expression and the scar cutting across the jaw told a great deal. This was no innocent bystander. Before Edward could utter a word, the stranger seized the girl's hand and was off, dragging her into the maze of alleys. Edward sprang forward, the soles of his boots slapping against the cobblestones. But as he turned the next corner, they were gone. The alley was deserted, except for the faint smell of damp earth and the lingering sense of violence. Edward stood frozen, his chest heaving as he stared into the empty shadows. He'd lost her again, but this time the stakes were higher. Whoever the cloaked figure was, they weren't just helping the girl escape. They had a purpose. And Edward couldn't shake the feeling that he was now entangled in something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Edward was in the narrow alley. The rainwater collected around his boots while his eyes probed into the maze of shadows. His chest heaved after the chase, while in his mind, questions came tumbling around in the darkness of the instant moment. The girl, the necklace, the scar-faced stranger. Every fragment of what happened felt like part of some major web, one that he could not see himself trapped within. "Where are they?" he muttered, the sound drowned out by the rain. He whipped around, his eyes scouring the thin alleys for anything. Then he spotted it. A little shred of cloth caught on a rusty nail protruding from a box. He yanked it loose and held it up toward the faint light of a nearby lantern. It was wet and frayed, but the pattern was unmistakable. The pale blue thread matched the tattered cloak she had been wrapped in. Edward's stomach twisted. This wasn't some random street child. The quality of the fabric was far too fine. It confirmed his growing suspicion. She wasn't an ordinary beggar. The dripping of the wet cloak from Edward's shoulder, he strode through to the archives, the clean marble floors beneath his feet showing spots. The storm had muted the usual hum of activity along the great halls, which was usually filled with chatter. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Within, rows of shelved, well-maintained records reached the vaulted ceiling. Edward looked around the room, his gaze settling upon a man who sat with his head buried in the work at a desk. "Archivist," he said gruffly, marching up to the elderly man. The old man started up and began to quiver as he clutched his feather within midair. "Sir Bolton," the archivist stammered, "how can I help you?" "I need records on Lady Eleanor's daughter," Edward ordered. "Everything you have. Now." The archivist blinked, his hands fumbling with the quill. "The king ordered all information on Lady Eleanor's child sealed during the search," he said cautiously. "Only those with express permission." Edward slammed a hand onto the desk, silencing the man. "This is a matter of palace security. If you delay, I'll ensure the king hears of your incompetence." The archivist paled and nodded quickly, shuffling toward a set of locked cabinets. A moment later, he returned with a thin, leather-bound dossier. "This is all I have," he said, sliding it across the desk. Edward snatched it up and opened it, his eyes scanning the sparse information. Amelia Eleanor Ashbourne, aged 8, last seen in the company of her nanny during a royal procession. The description of her dark hair and delicate features matched the girl he had kicked in the courtyard. But then Edward's eyes landed on a detail that sent his blood to ice. A hand-to-catch of the necklace she had been wearing the day she disappeared stared at him, identical to the one clutched in her tiny hands. He slammed the dossier shut. "Is this all?" he demanded. The archivist hesitated. "There were rumors," he said softly. "Some said she was taken, others that she ran away, but none were confirmed." Edward's jaw tightened. If Amelia had truly run away, how had she ended up here? And who was helping her? He turned on his heel and strode out of the archives, the dossier tucked under his arm. The storm raging, Edward was back in the alley where he had last seen the girl. He had to go back and retrace his steps to find the stranger who took her. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 other guards, both younger and less experienced than Edward, flanked him as they scoured the narrow streets. "Are you sure this is necessary, Sir Bolton?" one of them asked, a slight quiver in his tone. "It's just a child." Edward shot him a look that silenced him. "This isn't just about a child," he growled. "It's about the security of the crown." They moved deeper into the alleys, their torches casting flickering shadows on the damp walls. The air felt heavier here, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then, one of the guards called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Over here!" Edward hastened to his side, his torch lit. It was a rude camp in the depths of the alcove, a still smoldering fire with remnants strewn on the ground. And then he saw the piece of parchment folded and lying upon an open crate nearby. Edward snatched it up, unfolded it, and with a jerk in his breathing read the few scrawled words in red ink. "The girl is not safe here. Take her to the harbor at first light. The ship to Ashport leaves at dawn." Edward's grip on the parchment tightened. Whoever the scarred stranger was, they were planning to smuggle Amelia out of the city. He turned to the guards, his voice low and commanding. "We split up. Search every alley near the docks. We can't let them leave the city." As the guards scattered, Edward's mind raced. The stakes had escalated far beyond an act of cruelty in the courtyard. If the girl reached the harbor, he would lose not only her, but any chance to undo the mistake now threatening his career, and possibly his life. Edward delved deeper into the alleys, his torch dancing in the wind. The rain subsided, leaving only the chill of dampness in its wake, seeping into his bones. He rounded a corner and froze. There, ahead of him, stood the scarred stranger in the shadows. The cloak billowed slightly as he turned to face him, the glint of a dagger catching the light from the torch. "You should have stayed in your palace, guard," the stranger sneered. Edward drew his sword as his muscles coiled in tension. "Where is the girl?" he asked. The stranger sneered, inching closer. "She's beyond your reach, and soon so will I be." Before Edward had time to reply, the stranger leaped forward in a flash of steel upon steel, the blades hissing with sparks, clanging with a deafening ring. The 2 blades met again and again within the close space of the alley. The stranger was agile and swift in his movements. Another blow pressed Edward down to one knee, gasping, his hold on the sword stronger. Then, in one sudden brutal shove, the stranger knocked him off balance, sending him crashing into a stack of barrels. By the time Edward regained his footing, the stranger was gone, the alley empty once more. But this time, they had left something behind, a bloodied scrap of blue fabric clutched in Edward's hand. It wasn't over, not yet. The storm had passed, leaving the city swathed in an eerie stillness, but Edward's mind was anything but calm. His breathing was shallow, his fingers wrapped tightly around the bloodied shred of blue fabric while he stood in the deserted alley. The girl was close, so were her captors. He could feel it. Yet the stranger's skill had shaken him. This was no ordinary thief or mercenary. Whoever they were willing to kill for her. Edward pressed on, his footsteps heavier now, each echoing with the weight of his failure. Ahead of him, the docks were a maze of groaning ships, abandoned crates, and shadowy figures darting in and out of sight. The salty air stung his nose, mingling with the smell of rain-soaked wood. He glanced out to sea, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the water. The ship to Ashport would leave very soon. He saw the 2 guards he had sent out earlier, both standing near a cluster of barrels, their faces pale and tense. "Report," Edward ordered as he approached, his voice sharper than he intended. One of the guards swallowed hard, avoiding Edward's gaze. "Sir, we've found no sign of the girl, but there's been activity near Pier 9, a few suspicious figures loading crates." "Crates?" Edward's jaw clenched. "And you didn't investigate?" The younger guard hesitated. "We thought it might be best to wait for you, sir. The figures, they were armed." Cowards, Edward thought, but he didn't waste breath voicing it. "Show me." Pier 9 was a far cry from the silent alleys Edward had left behind. Here the air vibrated with tension, the creak of ropes and the soft lapping of waves breaking the stillness. Ahead, a ship loomed, its silhouette imposing against the faint light of dawn. Figures moved swiftly up and down the gangplank, carrying crates onto the vessel. Edward crouched behind a stack of barrels, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His pulse quickened when he spotted the girl. She was there, huddled near the base of the gangplank, her small frame dwarfed by the scarred stranger who stood beside her, barking orders to the men loading the ship. The girl's face was pale, her wide eyes darting frantically, as if searching for an escape. Edward's instincts roared to life. This was his chance to end it. He turned to the guards at his side. "Stay here and cover me," he hissed. "If things go wrong, signal the palace." "But sir," one of them began, his voice trembling. "I said stay here," Edward snapped, leaving no room for argument. He drew his sword, the weight of the steel grounding him as he moved silently toward the pier. He crept closer, his boots making barely a sound against the slick wood. The scarred stranger was focused on the crates, his back turned. Edward tightened his grip on his sword, his breath steady as he prepared to strike. But just as he was closing the distance, the girl's gaze locked onto him. Her eyes went wide, and she let out a small, involuntary gasp. The scarred man spun around, his dagger flashing in the dawn light. "So, the palace dog finally found us," the stranger sneered, his tone mocking but edged with menace. He pushed the girl behind him, his stance shifting into a fighter's crouch. "You should have stayed where you belonged, guard." Edward lunged, his sword swooping through the air. With a nearly inhuman swiftness, the stranger dodged and their blades clashed, spraying sparks. The clangor sent the dock workers scattering, their shouts echoing back from a distance. The fight was intense and swift. The stranger struck with a precision that made Edward block the blows continuously, his muscles taut. His opponent was not just skilled but relentless too, every move calculated in wearing him down. "You don't even know who she is, do you?" the stranger taunted as their blades locked. Edward pushed back with a growl, forcing the man to stumble. "She's not just some lost child, she's your reckoning." Edward's breath came in ragged gasps. "She's the king's blood," he spat, "and I'll see her returned." The stranger laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The king's blood? You think you're saving her? You have no idea what you've stepped into." The words sent a chill down Edward's spine, but he didn't falter. He surged forward, forcing the stranger toward the edge of the pier. With a final powerful swing, he knocked the dagger from the man's hand and sent it skittering across the wood. The stranger staggered, his footing precarious. Edward raised his sword, the tip hovering inches from the man's throat. "Yield," he growled. But the scarred man smiled, his eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. "It's too late." Before Edward had time to act, the man whistled loudly. A figure burst out of the darkness, snatched the girl and pulled her toward the ship. Edward spun around as the girl shrieked, her voice slicing through the dawn like a knife. In that instant, the stranger launched himself at Edward, and both went tumbling through the air into the icy waters below. The shock of the cold stole Edward's breath as he flailed against the current, the world above him a blur of muffled shouts and slapping waves. When he finally surfaced, gasping for air, the ship was already drawing away from the dock. The girl stood on its deck, her tear-streaked face turned to him as the scar-faced stranger joined her, a mocking salute on his lips. Edward clung to the edge of the pier, his knuckles white, as he watched the ship disappear into the mist. He had failed. The girl was gone, and the weight of his mistake loomed over him, threatening to pull him under once more. Edward heaved himself onto the pier, his wet uniform clinging to his skin, his breathing ragged. The cold water had sapped his strength, but the sight of the ship disappearing into the fog reignited a fire in his chest. He slammed a fist against the wooden planks, the sound echoing in the eerie stillness. The girl was gone. Amelia. His failure burned like acid in his gut. The king's cousin's child, her fate now lost in the hands of a scarred stranger and whatever sinister forces had orchestrated this. "Sir!" The two guards he'd left behind came rushing toward him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with panic. "Are you injured? What happened?" Edward ignored their questions, pulling himself upright. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what had just occurred. "The ship," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Did you see the name? Anything?" The younger guard shook his head helplessly. "No, sir. It vanished too quickly." Edward swore under his breath, but then the older guard hesitated. His expression was at war within itself. "There's something else, sir. Someone left this just after you disappeared into the water." He held out a folded piece of parchment. Its edges were damp from the rain. Edward snatched it and unfolded it with shaking hands. The message inside was brief, but it hit him like a thunderclap. "Return to the palace. You've been looking in the wrong place all along." Edward's eyes narrowed, the weight of the words pressing down on him. "The wrong place?" he muttered. His mind raced. The docks, the ship, the girl, it had all felt like a diversion. But why, and for what purpose? The answer came unbidden: the palace. In just a few minutes, the big oak wood palace gates stormed open for a sodden, boot-clad Edward, who set a trail of water through to those spotless floors. Lively servants skipped out of his way into the finest suites of the royals, skimming through till the letter seemed fairly clear, that the actual danger wasn't out there amidst alleys nor aboard this ship. It was just inside of these walls, precisely inside the area he'd sworn to guard. Bursting into the king's private antechamber, Edward found the steward waiting for him. The older man looked startled, his usually composed demeanor cracking at the sight of Edward's disheveled state. "Sir Bolton, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" the steward demanded. "Where is the king?" Edward growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through stone. The steward hesitated, his eyes darting to the closed doors of the throne room. "He's in a private audience. You cannot—" Edward bullied past him and made the heavy doors fly open as he entered. The king sat at the head of the long table, flanked by a small council of advisors. At the center of that table was a figure Edward knew, scar and all. Edward's sword was in his hand before he realized it, the blade glinting in the torchlight as he pointed it directly at the man. "Your Majesty, that man! He's taken Amelia! He's behind the kidnapping!" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The king's piercing gaze shifted between Edward and the scarred stranger, who stood unfazed, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're mistaken, Sir Bolton," the king said calmly, his voice like ice. "This man is here on my orders." Edward froze, the words not registering at first. "Your orders?" he repeated, lowering his blade slightly. "Your Majesty, he took Lady Eleanor's daughter. He's—" "Enough!" the king snapped, rising from his seat. "You've been chasing shadows, Edward. Amelia was never taken by force. She fled the palace of her own accord." The revelation hit Edward like a blow to the chest. "Fled? But why?" The scarred stranger finally spoke, his voice cold and sharp. "Because she knew the truth. About you. About this palace. About your king." He gestured toward the monarch with a slight sneer. "The child saw through the lies you've all been living under." "Lies?" Edward's mind reeled as the king said nothing, his face unreadable. But the stranger forged ahead. Amelia wasn't running away. She was running toward safety. From him. He pointed a gloved finger at the king, and his words seemed to resound within the chamber. She learned the truth of her bloodline, who her true father was. Gasps and murmurs exploded through the room. Edward recoiled a step, his grip on the sword in his hand slackening. "Her real father?" The words were like a foreign language in his mouth. "She's not Lady Eleanor's daughter," the stranger repeated, undeterred. "She's the king's illegitimate child, the rightful heir to the throne." The chamber fell into complete, stark silence. Edward's world was spinning. The pieces clicked. Her disappearance, the necklace, the secrecy concerning her. It wasn't just some sort of missing child case. It was about some kind of hidden threat to the crown. The king's face darkened, and his voice boomed as he spoke to Edward. "You have overstepped, Bolton. Your actions have jeopardized everything. Amelia's safety, the integrity of this palace, the trust of the people." Edward's knees buckled under with the weight of such a revelation. He had given his life to serve this crown, enforced its rule, protected its image. Yet, blinded by arrogance and blind loyalty, he had become a pawn in something far greater than he'd ever realized. The scarred stranger stepped closer, his piercing gaze fixed upon Edward. "You were so quick to punish that girl, so sure of your authority, but you never stopped to ask the right questions. You failed her." Edward dropped to his knees, his sword clattering to the floor. The enormity of his mistake crushed him. He had not only failed in the protection of Amelia, but had played a part in endangering her further. And as the scarred stranger leaned down, his voice lowered to a near whisper. The truth always comes out, guard. The question is, will you stand with it or against it? Edward's head bowed under the weight of the stranger's words now settling upon him. This was no longer about loyalty to the crown. It was about redemption, a truth he had been ignoring. Edward knelt on the cold marble floor of the throne room, his head bowed under the weight of his failure. The scarred stranger's words echoed in his mind. The truth always comes out. The room was silent now, the stunned murmurs of the king's advisors fading into a heavy stillness. He had always thought himself a man of honor, loyal to the crown and realm, but that was what had blinded him. He had acted without thinking, without compassion, and this was what had resulted. Sir Bolton, the king's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharp and commanding. Edward lifted his head to meet the monarch's gaze. The king's face was etched with anger, but behind it lay something else, fear. You have caused irreparable harm, not only to Lady Eleanor, but to this entire palace. Edward opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What was he to say? That he was sorry? That he had acted rashly? None of it would undo the damage he had caused. The scarred stranger stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the king. Your Majesty, this isn't about Sir Bolton. This is about the rot at the heart of your rule. Your child, was forced to flee for her life because of corruption and deceit festering within these walls. Blame him if you must, but the truth is this palace failed her long before he did. The king's jaw flexed, his hands whitening on the edge of the table. For a moment it seemed he would erupt at any instant in anger, then his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the stranger's words. Where is she now? He asked, quieter, even a little hesitant. The scar above the stranger's eyebrow twisted, his expression softening, but his eyes never lost their intensity. She's safe for now, but she won't return unless she's certain this place will not destroy her. The king looked at Edward. And you, Sir Bolton? What have you to say for yourself? Edward forced himself to his feet, his soaked uniform clinging to his frame. He straightened his spine, though the shame in his heart weighed heavy. Your Majesty, I failed. I let my arrogance and blind loyalty cloud my judgment. I saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be dealt with, and for that I am truly sorry. The king's eyes narrowed. Sorry is not enough. Your actions nearly cost Amelia her life. Edward nodded, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life making it right if you'll let me. Let me find her. Let me protect her. Not for the crown, but because it is the right thing to do. The scar-faced stranger arched a brow. The faintest tugging at the corner of his lips suggested a smile. That is most noble of you to say. The same man who kicked her into the mud, of course. Edward winced, though held his place. I cannot take back my actions, but I can ensure she never faces such fear again. The room was silent as the king regarded Edward, his expression inscrutable. Finally he spoke. Very well. You will have one chance, Sir Bolton. Find her. Bring her back. And when you do, prove to her, not to me, not to this court, that you are more than the man she saw in the courtyard. Edward left the throne room with a renewed sense of purpose. Though the guilt still weighed heavily on his shoulders, the scarred stranger followed him into the corridor, his steps measured and deliberate. You've got a long road ahead, guard, the stranger said, his tone less biting now. Earning her trust won't be easy. Edward nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. I don't expect it to be, but I'll do whatever it takes. The stranger studied him for a moment, then reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. She's not far, but don't expect her to welcome you with open arms. Edward took the parchment, his hands steadied despite the storm in his heart. Thank you. The stranger only nodded curtly. Don't thank me yet. You have much to atone for. By the time Edward reached the edge of the city, the sun was well up, and the parchment guided him to a small, secluded inn. He drew up his horse, his heart pounding, and dismounted at the door. The girl sat inside by a crackling fire, wrapped in her blanket, small and harmless. Her wide eyes met his as he entered, and across her face danced fear. Edward stopped a few feet away, lowering himself to one knee to meet her gaze. He pulled his sword off and laid it on the ground beside him, a sign of peace. Amelia, he whispered, his voice shaking. I am so sorry. I didn't see you for who you are. I only saw what I thought you weren't. She stared at him, her grip tightening on the edge of the blanket. Why are you here? To make things right, Edward said simply. Not for the king, not for the palace. For you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I will protect you no matter what it takes. Amelia studied him for one long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then she did speak, her voice not much above a whisper. "You hurt me." The muscles in Edward's throat jerked. "I know," he said, and his voice cracked. "And I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." Heath-strewn silence continued to stretch between them and was heavy with unspoken undercurrents. Then slowly, she nodded. "You can stay," she said softly, "but only because I don't trust the others." Edward nodded, and his eyes stung with tears. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. With the passing of days turning to weeks, Edward dedicated himself to the protection of Amelia, not as a royal guard, but as a man in search of redemption. He began to listen, and to look beyond his assumptions to the weight of his actions. Through her he found not just a purpose, but also a truth he had long overlooked. That loyalty meant nothing without compassion, authority, nothing without humility. It would be Amelia's final decision, of course, but there was one thing Edward knew with clarity. He would stand beside her, no longer as protection to the crown, but as protector of her future. Sir Edmund's royal guard palm landed across the boy's cheek with the force that sent him staggering backward. The sound of the slap carried across the cobblestone courtyard, silencing the hum of activity as servants and guards froze in place. The boy, no older than 12, clutched his face in shock, wide eyes welling with tears as he stared up at the towering guard before him. "How dare you?" Edmund spat, his voice slicing through silence after a moment's pause. This boy, in rags for clothes, quivered under Edmund's gaze, one hand clasping a battered satchel close to his chest. "This is royal ground, not some market square for urchins such as yourself. I did not mean any harm," he stammered, trying to speak, his voice breaking with the effort. With a backward step, bare feet scraped on stone. Edmund sneered, stepping forward and towering over the boy. "No harm?" he spat. "You don't belong here. If I catch you skulking around again, you'll answer to more than just my hand." The boy flinched, but didn't run. Instead, he held onto the satchel even tighter, his small frame trembling with the effort to stay upright. He opened his mouth to say something, but Edmund cut him off with an impatient growl. "Enough! Be gone before I drag you to the dungeons myself." With that, the boy turned and bolted toward the gates, his feet slapping against the stone as he disappeared into the bustling marketplace beyond. Edmund watched him go, a look of contempt upon his face. He brushed his hands together as if to shake the interaction off and muttered under his breath, "Street rats, they multiply like vermin." As he turned back to resume his patrol, something on the ground caught his eye. A small golden object gleamed in the sunlight, partially hidden among the cobblestones. Edmund bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was a medallion, surprisingly heavy for its size and engraved with an intricate design. The instant his fingers closed around it, a strange unease settled over him. The metal was warm, almost unnaturally so, and as he examined it closer, he saw a faint engraving of a royal crest, a mark he recognized instantly. "What in the name of—" Edmund muttered, his voice trailing off as a sense of dread began to creep into his chest. Before he could collect his thoughts, a breathless voice called out behind him. "Sir Edmund!" He turned to see one of the older stewards of the palace make his way toward him with hastening steps and a countenance that bespoke concern. "There is urgent news from His Majesty," he said in stumbling words. "A boy carrying a medallion with the royal crest. He is to be brought into the palace without delay. He mustn't be harmed at any cost." Edmund's blood ran cold. His hand clutched the medallion as if its warmth was an accusation. Before his mind came the frightened face of that boy, followed by the sting of his slap. Beyond the gates that boy was running, and Edmund finally realized in a rising horror he had just made a terrible mistake. Edmund stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The medallion seemed to burn hotter in his hand as the steward's words echoed in his mind. Could he find the boy in time, or would the consequences of his actions be irreversible? Edmund paced the courtyard, the medallion still clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing. The steward's words echoed in his ears, colliding with the image of the boy's tear-streaked face. Why hadn't he paused to listen? Why had his temper gotten the better of him? He cursed under his breath, the weight of his own arrogance settling heavily on his shoulders. It was warmer now, as if it mocked him. He flipped it over, observing the detailed design. Undeniably, it was the royal crest, yet it seemed older, more decorative than the emblem used nowadays. Around its edges were symbols Edmund couldn't understand, as foreign as the situation he now found himself in. A cold sweat was developing on his brow. This is too much. If he found that the boy was with this medallion, then he wasn't simply some street urchin. He could be someone important, someone dangerous to offend. Edmund's gut twisted with the thought. His thoughts were broken by the sharp clatter of boots on stone as another guard approached, his face set in a tense mask. "Sir Edmund," he said, his voice low, "there's an incident reported near the marketplace. A boy of the steward's description has been spotted running from two men. Witnesses said he seemed terrified." Edmund felt a vice tighten in his chest. "Chased?" he repeated, though he knew the answer. "Yes, sir," the guard replied. "They didn't appear to be guards or city watch, likely mercenaries. His Majesty has been informed, and orders are to retrieve the boy at all costs." Edmund swore under his breath and barked, "Gather a search party. Sweep the marketplace and surrounding alleys." He hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of duty, before finally adding, "I'll join the search myself." The guard's eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Within moments, Edmund strode through the bustle of the marketplace, the medallion tucked now into his belt. The cheerful din of merchants calling out their wares and customers haggling prices grated on his nerves as he scanned the crowd for any sign of the boy. His eyes picked up glimpses of children darting between stalls, but not one of them was the boy he sought. Then he saw it, a flash of that same threadbare tunic disappearing into a narrow alley. Edmund's heart leapt to his throat as he broke into a run, his armor clanking with each step. Rounding the corner in time, he could have sworn that he had just seen a boy with a satchel clambering over a stack of crates. "Stop!" Edmund yelled, voice echoing off alley walls. The boy froze for a fraction of a second, his head snapping toward the sound. Edmund saw the panic in his eyes, the fear etched into his small face. But before he could move to intercept, two burly figures emerged from the shadows further down the alley. The men were rough-looking, with unkempt beards and weapons strapped to their belts. One of them grinned, revealing crooked teeth. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, stepping toward the boy. "Back off," Edmund barked, drawing his sword and leveling it at the men. The steel gleamed in the dim light. "This boy is under royal protection." The grin vanished, and in its place came a scowl. "Royal protection, you say?" he growled. "Doesn't look like anyone's protecting him now." He reached for the boy. Edmund stepped between them, his blade flickering as he swung it, warningly. The other man pulled back, eyeing the sword warily. Seizing his opportunity, the young boy darted behind the back of Edmund and clutched his leather satchel like a shield. "Please," he whispered, "don't let them take me." Edmund didn't say a word. His mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. If these men were after the boy, then the medallion must be far more significant than he'd realized. And the boy, he was no ordinary child. But who was he? And what did he carry that could draw such dangerous attention? "Stand down," Edmund growled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to cross the royal guard." The first mercenary hesitated, glancing at his companion. But the second man wasn't so easily deterred. He drew a dagger from his belt and smirked. "Oh, I think we do." Before Edmund could act, he lunged at him. The blade swung to block, its ringing loud against his attacker's steel as the tussle dragged on through this desperate alley fight. One boy screaming, scrambling backward toward crates. Every swing of his sword was met with resistance, every move calculated to keep the boy out of harm's way. But the mercenaries were relentless, their attacks growing more aggressive with each passing moment. Edmund's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to hold them off, his mind racing with questions he didn't have time to answer. Finally, with a well-placed strike, Edmund sent one of the men flying, his dagger skittering across the ground. The other man hesitated, glancing between Edmund and his fallen comrade, before seeming to decide that the fight wasn't worth the risk. With a muttered curse, he grabbed his partner by the arm and dragged him to his feet. "This isn't over," the man spat at Edmund. "The boy doesn't belong to you." Edmund didn't lower his sword until the two men disappeared into the shadows. Then he turned to the boy, who was still huddled against the crates, his chest heaving with fear. "Who are you?" Edmund demanded, his voice harsh but laced with urgency. "And why are they after you?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a scroll, its edges gilded with gold. He held it out with trembling hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "You need to take me to the king," he whispered, "before it's too late." The sight of the gilded scroll in the boy's shaking hands made Edmund's brain swim with confusion and unease. Elaborate details on the parchment spoke unmistakably of royalty. It was no simple thing he held in this quivering child's hands and raised questions he did not want to hear. "What is this?" Edmund barked impatiently. The boy clutched the scroll tighter, shrinking back. "It's meant for the king," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Edmund snapped, stepping closer. He wasn't in the mood for riddles, not after what he'd just endured in that alley. The boy flinched but didn't answer, his wide eyes darting toward the shadows as though expecting the mercenaries to reappear at any moment. Before Edmund could press him further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the alley. His grip tightened on his sword as he turned toward the noise, expecting another fight. Instead, A palace guard rounded the corner, panting heavily. The man's face was flushed with exertion, and his eyes went wide as he saw Edmund. "Sir Edmund!" the guard gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. There's been an attack at the palace." Edmund froze. "What kind of attack?" "An assassination attempt on His Majesty," the guard said, his voice trembling. "The perpetrators escaped, but they left behind evidence orders from an unknown faction targeting the royal family." The boy made a little involuntary noise, and Edmund's gaze snapped to him. The child's face had gone pale, his knuckles white, where he clutched the scroll. "What does this have to do with him?" Edmund demanded, jerking his sword in the boy's direction. "Speak, boy, now." The boy stammered. His chest heaved as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he whispered, "They're after me because of what I know." "What you know?" Edmund repeated, disbelieving. "You're a child. What could you possibly—" The boy cut him off, his voice rising with an equal mix of fear and defiance. "I'm not just a child. I'm the king's nephew." The revelation hit Edmund like a punch to the gut. He staggered back a step, his sword dipping as he stared at the boy in disbelief. The king's nephew? It couldn't be. The king's only sibling, his younger brother, had died years ago, leaving behind no known heirs. This boy's claim was impossible. "You're lying," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're just trying to save yourself." The boy stared at him, his eyes ablaze with determination. "The medallion, the scroll, it's all proof. My father entrusted it to me before he was killed. They've been hunting me ever since." Edmund's mind was reeling. The medallion, with its ancient crest, the scroll carrying the king's seal, the desperation in the boy. It all began to fall into place in a way that soured his stomach. If what the boy said was true, then Edmund had just struck the heir to the throne. Before he could respond, the boy grabbed his arm, his small fingers gripping the leather of Edmund's gauntlet with surprising strength. "You have to take me to the king," he pleaded, his voice urgent. "He's in danger, and so am I. They won't stop until they kill us both." Edmund hesitated, caught between his duty and his own disbelief. Could this boy really be who he said he was? And if so, what did that make Edmund's actions earlier? The slap, the accusations seemed to wrap around his neck like a noose. The sound of distant shouting pierced his thoughts. The mercenaries had returned, their voices echoing through narrow streets. Edmund cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on his sword. "We need to move," he growled. "Now." The boy nodded, clutching his satchel and scroll as Edmund led him deeper into the twisting alleys. The marketplace was no longer an option. They needed a secure route back to the palace. Every shadow seemed to hold danger, every sound a harbinger of pursuit. As they ran, the boy spoke, his words rushed and disjointed. "My father. He knew something about the king's council. There's a traitor, someone who wants the throne for themselves. That's why they killed him. That's why they're after me." "A traitor?" Edmund growled, his anger flared. "Who?" The boy shook his head, pale in the face. "I don't know. My father didn't trust anybody, not even the king, and so told me only to run and deliver this to His Majesty." Edmund's mind was racing. If there was a traitor within the king's inner circle, no one was to be trusted, not even the guards patrolling the palace now. And here he was, escorting the most important boy in the kingdom through streets teeming with hired killers. They turned a corner and almost ran into a group of palace guards. Edmund raised his hand, ready to issue an order, but something in the guards' expressions froze him cold. Their eyes were cold, their stances too stiff. These men weren't here to help. "Hand over the boy," the leader said, his voice low and menacing. Edmund stepped in front of the boy, his sword at the ready. "Over my dead body," the leader smirked. "That can be arranged." The boy tugged on Edmund's arm. "They're with the traitor," he whispered. "We have to get out of here." As the guards began to move towards him, Edmund's grasp on his sword tightened. The chances were against them, and his instincts seemed to scream. It was but the opening act of a much greater peril game. There was nowhere to run. And in that moment, Edmund knew the palace was not a haven, but merely a figment of safety he had wanted to believe in. The traitorous guards closed in, their eyes fixed upon the boy, and Edmund's heart raced in his chest. The alley now seemed to have shrunk further. The walls pressed near as the weight of his choices fell squarely on him. There was no time for thinking, only to act. Edmund raised his sword, its edge keen in the dim light, and planted himself before the boy. "Stay behind me," he growled over his shoulder. The leader of the rogue guards smirked, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. "You're making a mistake, Sir Edmund. Hand over the boy, and we can all walk away from this." Edmund's jaw clenched. "I've made one mistake today, and I won't make another. You'll have to kill me first." The smirk had faded. So be it. The leader made a quick, violent gesture. His men charged, the first guard in, his blade flashing in the air. Edmund parried with a grunt. The clash of steel on steel echoed down the alley. He shifted, blocking another strike and countering with a precise swing that forced his attacker to stumble back. "Run!" Edmund yelled at the boy, who was frozen with fear. "Find a way out of here!" The boy looked around, his little body quivering, before he suddenly ran towards a small gap between two buildings. One of the guards tried to cut him off, but Edmund moved in a flash, his sword slicing through the air between them. The guard recoiled with a snarl, blood dripping from his arm. The leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough playing! Kill the guard and capture the boy!" Two men rushed Edmund at once. He barely managed to block the first strike, twisting to avoid the second. His movements were quick but desperate. Every swing of his sword drained his strength, and every clash of blades reminded him that he was outnumbered. He couldn't keep this up much longer. Behind him, the boy squeezed through the gap, clutching his satchel as though it held his very life. Edmund risked a glance over his shoulder. Relief washed over him as he saw the boy disappear into the shadows. But that split-second distraction cost him. A blade sliced across his shoulder, and he hissed in pain, staggering backward. "Drop your weapon!" one of the guards shouted, pressing the advantage. Edmund ignored him, gripping his sword tighter despite the blood dripping from his wound. He wouldn't fall here, not before ensuring the boy's safety. Summoning the last of his strength, Edmund counterattacked. His blade whirled in an arc, forcing his enemies to retreat. He fought like a cornered animal, his movements fueled by sheer determination rather than skill. Another guard fell to the ground, clutching his side, but Edmund knew he couldn't hold them all off forever. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The rogue guards paused, their heads snapping toward the sound. Edmund, panting and bloodied, turned to see a group of royal guards entering the alley. For a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Reinforcements at last. But that hope was short-lived. The leader of the traitorous guards stepped forward, his expression dark. "These men are with us. Stand down, Edmund. You're surrounded." The blood drained from Edmund's face as the truth hit him like a blow. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. These weren't just a few rogue guards, they were part of a larger conspiracy, a network that extended into the heart of the palace. "You've chosen the wrong side," Edmund spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. The leader chuckled. "The wrong side? No, Sir Edmund, you have. That boy is a threat to the kingdom. You're risking everything for a child who shouldn't even exist." Edmund's grip on his sword tightened. "The only threat to the kingdom is men like you." The leader's smile vanished. "Enough of this." He raised his hand, signaling the combined forces to close in. Edmund steeled himself for the final assault, knowing it would be his last stand. Before the guards could attack him, a deafening roar rang out down the alley. The ground shook beneath their feet as a massive horse thundered into view, its rider cloaked in the deep blue of the royal family's elite guard. "Stand down, traitors!" the rider bellowed, his voice commanding and unmistakable. It was Captain Harrow, leader of the palace's most loyal soldiers. His sword was drawn, and his steely gaze swept over the gathered men. The rogue guards hesitated, their confidence faltering. Harrow dismounted in one fluid motion, his presence radiating authority. He pointed his blade at the leader. "Drop your weapons, or face the king's justice." The leader sneered but didn't move. "You're too late, Captain. The boy is already lost." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "The only thing lost here is your honor." In the confusion, Edmund staggered to Harrow's side, blood dripping from his shoulder. "The boy escaped," he said, his voice low. "But they're after him. He has the scroll." Harrow nodded, his face grim. "Then we must find him before they do. If that scroll falls into the wrong hands." He didn't finish the thought. But Edmund knew the kingdom's future hung in the balance, and the boy was the key. Behind them, the traitors reassembled, their hesitation giving way to renewed resolve. Edmund and Harrow raised their swords, their determination not shaken by the odds. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The boy's feet pounded the cobblestones as he sprinted through the twisting city streets, his satchel bouncing against his side. Every breath was a gasp, every shadow a threat. He clutched the scroll tightly, his fingers trembling as though they could feel the weight of the kingdom's future within the parchment. Behind him, the din of battle was muffled. Clashing swords, barked orders, and Edmund's unmistakable roar of defiance. The guard who had struck him earlier was now his only protector, and the boy's chest tightened with guilt. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but it had to. It was the only way to expose the truth. The boy ducked into a dimly lit passageway and pressed himself against the wall, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. His heart thundered in his ears as he peeked around the corner, scanning for signs of pursuit. For now, the streets were quiet. But he knew it wouldn't last. He opened the satchel and carefully retrieved the medallion and the scroll. The medallion was warm to the touch, its intricate engraving a silent promise. He unrolled the scroll, his eyes running over words in his father's familiar hand. There it all was. The names, the plans, the betrayal. There was the council member who had masterminded his father's assassination. He was the one who made the king dependent upon all the wrong advisors. It was a grab for the throne, pure and simple. A treacherous coup soaked in blood. One name in particular jumped from the bottom of the parchment. Captain Harrow. The boy's hands began to shake. Harrow, the man who just now rode into battle to save him, was the very traitor his father had warned him about. It was Harrow, the king's most trusted military advisor, who engineered this whole conspiracy, hiring mercenaries to hunt the boy, dispatching guards loyal to his cause, and now masquerading as protector of the crown while plotting its downfall. The boy's breath hitched. If he exposed this truth to Edmund, would the guard even believe him? Or would Harrow's reputation shield him from suspicion? He had no allies left, except one, the king. The boy clambered to his feet, determination replacing caution. Tucking the scroll back in his satchel, slipping through alleys in the direction of the palace gates. Every step seemed to him a running out of time. Harrow wouldn't scruple to remove him the moment the fight was over. Edmond's patronage would be worthless when the captain decided upon that. The boy reached the palace walls, his small frame slipping through a servant's entrance unnoticed. He kept to the shadows, navigating the familiar corridors with practiced ease. It wasn't the first time he had been here, but it was the first time he felt like an intruder in his own home. At last he gained the throne room. The huge doors stood before him, the carvings on them representing the greatness of the kingdom. Summoning every inch of courage, the boy pushed them open and stepped inside. The king sat at the far end of the hall, his face weary and lined with age. Beside him stood Captain Harrow, his armor gleaming and his expression calm. The sight of the captain sent a shiver down the boy's spine, but he forced himself forward. "Your Majesty!" he cried, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. The king looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is this child?" Before the boy could reply, Harrow stepped forward, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty, this is the boy who has caused so much trouble. He carries stolen property. He cannot be trusted." "That's a lie," the boy shouted, holding the satchel close to his chest. "I carry the truth my father died to protect." The king's eyes widened, and he stared, his gaze darting back and forth between the boy and Harrow. "Your father?" The boy surged forward, drawing the medallion from the satchel and holding it high. "I am Thomas, son of Prince Alden. My father was your brother." The blood fled the king's face as a murmur ran over the room. Harrow's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, his mask of serenity slipping. "I have proof," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. He opened the satchel and unrolled the scroll, presenting it to the king. "This scroll reveals everything. Who betrayed my father? Who has been plotting against you? Who wants to take your throne?" The king took the scroll with trembling hands, and his eyes scanned the parchment. With every word, darker and darker grew his features. His lips pressed to a thin line. At last he looked up, his gaze locking on Harrow. "Is this true?" the king demanded, in a voice that was cold as ice. Harrow didn't even flinch. "Your Majesty, that scroll is a fabrication. The boy is desperate to save himself. He has no proof." Small as he was, there was an unmistakable core of defiance running through Thomas now. "You've lied enough, Harrow. My father trusted you and you betrayed him. You sent mercenaries to kill me. You're the one who gave the order to attack the palace today." For a moment, Harrow's composure broke. His sword flashed out of its scabbard. The blade winked coldly in his hand, leveled at Thomas's heart. "You should have kept hidden, boy," he spat. "You seal your fate thus." The doors burst open and in stumbled Edmund, covered in blood yet still alive. His gaze latched onto the scene before him. The boy, the scroll, and Harrow's drawn sword. "Harrow," Edmund growled, taking a step forward, "what in the king's name are you doing?" Harrow's eyes darted between Edmund and the king, calculating his odds. He lunged toward Thomas, but Edmund was faster. With a roar, the royal guard intercepted the blow, his sword clashing against Harrow's with bone-jarring force. The fight was brief, but brutal. Edmund's determination, fueled by guilt and anger, overwhelmed Harrow's precision. In the end, Harrow's sword clattered to the ground and Edmund drove him to his knees. The king stood, his voice shaking with fury. "Captain Harrow, you have betrayed the crown, and you will answer for your crimes." Harrow, defeat twisting his face, spat on the ground. "You're blind, old man. The throne is weak, and I would have made it strong." "Take him away," the king ordered, and guards rushed to drag the traitor from the room. As silence fell, the king turned to Thomas, his expression softening. "You are truly Alden's son?" Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I am, Your Majesty, and I'm here to finish what my father started." The king knelt, pulling Thomas into a tight embrace. Edmund, standing nearby, felt a strange sense of relief and a newfound respect for the boy he had so gravely underestimated. Everything was different now. The future of the kingdom had been left to a child, and Edmund silently swore to protect him, whatever the cost. The sun was setting as Edmund stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the sprawling city below. The warm, golden light softened the jagged rooftops and cast long shadows across the streets. But the warmth did little to ease the chill in his chest. His hand instinctively brushed the bandage on his shoulder, a reminder of the events that had nearly cost both him and the boy their lives. Inside the throne room, Thomas stood before the king, the scroll and medallion laid reverently on a velvet-draped table. The boy's head was high, his posture steady, despite the enormity of what he had faced. Edmond couldn't help but admire him. Courage like that didn't come easily, especially for someone so young. The king placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his expression one of both grief and pride. "You are your father's son," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Prince Alden would be proud of you." "I only wish I had known the truth sooner," Thomas nodded solemnly. "I didn't want to believe it either, Your Majesty, but my father trusted me to carry this burden, and I couldn't let him down." The king glanced at the scroll, then back at the boy. "The betrayal cuts deep, but with this truth, we can root out the corruption that has plagued this court. Your bravery has saved this kingdom." Thomas lowered his gaze, his voice softening. "I only did what I had to. For my father. For the people." Edmond stepped forward, his armor catching the fading light. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low. The boy showed courage far beyond his years, but the fault lies with me. I wronged him, and I failed to see the truth until it was almost too late. The king turned to Edmund, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You erred, Sir Edmund, but you also stood by him when it mattered most. You faced overwhelming odds to protect him even when you didn't fully understand his importance. That is the duty of a royal guard." Edmund felt the weight of those words. Duty. It had been his guiding principle, but arrogance had blinded him to what duty truly meant. He met the boy's eyes, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly and put you in danger. I failed to honor my oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But you also risked your life to fix it. That's what matters." The boy's words hit Edmund harder than any blow he had taken in battle. He bowed his head, his chest tightening with a mixture of shame and gratitude. The king's voice broke the silence. "This ordeal has reminded us all of an important truth. Power and loyalty must be earned, not assumed. We cannot allow arrogance, betrayal, or fear to guide our actions." He turned to the gathered court, his gaze sweeping over the nobles and guards who had assembled to witness the resolution. "Today a boy taught us what it means to be brave, what it means to protect not just the crown, but the heart of the kingdom itself. Let this be a lesson to us all." The court murmured its agreement, heads nodding in respect. Thomas, standing tall beside the king, looked every bit the royal heir his father had hoped he would become. As the crowd began to disperse, Edmund approached Thomas. "You'll make a fine prince," he said, his voice quiet. "Better than most men I've known." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'll need people I can trust, people like you." The words caught Edmund off guard, but he nodded, a spark of determination reigniting within him. "Then you'll have me, always." Thomas extended his small hand, and Edmund took it, the boy's grip surprisingly firm. In that moment, the past seemed to fade away, replaced by a future that, while uncertain, felt brighter than it had in years. As the boy returned to the king's side, Edmund remained on the balcony, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. He thought of the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the courage of a boy who had reminded him what true duty and honor looked like. A royal guard protects the kingdom, but more importantly, its people. Edmund swore to himself that he would never forget that again. And far above the city, the night settled over the palace, calm and full of promise, as the kingdom took its first steps toward a better tomorrow. The sun was setting as Edmund stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the sprawling city below. The warm, golden light softened the jagged rooftops and cast long shadows across the streets, but the warmth did little to ease the chill in his chest. His hand instinctively brushed the bandage on his shoulder, a reminder of the events that had nearly cost both him and the boy their lives. Inside the throne room, Thomas stood before the king, On a table, velvet draped, he had laid the scroll and medallion reverently. The head of the boy was held high, his posture unrelenting despite what he faced in its enormity. Edmund couldn't help but admiration for him. Courage just didn't come easily hand in hand, especially when someone so young was returned. The king laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his face a mask of sorrow and pride. "You are your father's son," he said, his voice echoing off the chamber. "Prince Alden would be proud of you. I only wish I had known the truth sooner." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I didn't want to believe it either, your majesty, but my father trusted me to carry this burden, and I couldn't let him down." The king glanced at the scroll, then back at the boy. "The betrayal cuts deep, but with this truth, we can root out the corruption that has plagued this court. Your bravery has saved this kingdom." Thomas looked down, his voice quieting. "I only did what I had to. For my father. For the people." Edmund came forward then, his armor glinting in the dying light. "Your majesty," he said, bowing low. The boy showed courage far beyond his years. "But the fault lies with me. I wronged him, and I failed to see the truth until it was almost too late." The king now turned to Edmund, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You erred, Sir Edmund, but you also stood by him when it mattered most. You faced overwhelming odds to protect him, even when you didn't fully understand his importance. That is the duty of a royal guard." Edmund felt the weight of those words. Duty. It had been his guiding principle, but pride had blinded him to what that word meant. He met the boy's eyes, his voice steady but full of regret. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly and put you in danger. I failed to honor my oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But you also risked your life to fix it. That's what matters." The boy's words hit Edmund harder than any blow he had taken in battle. He bowed his head, his chest tightening with a mixture of shame and gratitude. The king's voice broke the silence. "This ordeal has reminded us all of an important truth. Power and loyalty must be earned, not assumed. We cannot allow arrogance, betrayal, or fear to guide our actions." He turned to the assembled court, his eyes sweeping across the nobles and guards who had gathered to witness the resolution. "Today a boy taught us what it means to be brave, what it means to protect not just the crown, but the heart of the kingdom itself. Let this be a lesson to us all." The court murmured in assent, heads nodding in respect. Thomas, standing tall beside the king, was every inch the royal heir his father had hoped he would become. As the crowd began to disperse, Edmund approached Thomas. "You'll make a fine prince," he said, his voice quiet. "Better than most men I've known." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'll need people I can trust, people like you." The words caught Edmund off guard, but he nodded, a spark of determination reigniting within him. "Then you'll have me, always." Thomas extended his small hand, and Edmund took it, the boy's grip surprisingly firm. In that moment, the past seemed to fade away, replaced by a future that, while uncertain, felt brighter than it had in years. As the boy was taken back to the king's side, Edmund stood on the balcony, seeing the first stars in the sky already darkening. He thought of lessons learnt, mistakes made, and of a boy's courage that reminded him of what true duty and honor looked like. A royal guard protects the kingdom, but most importantly its people. Edmund made a silent promise to himself to never forget that again. Far above the city, the night settled over the palace calm and full of promise, while the kingdom took the first steps toward a better tomorrow.